Rapport isn't everything. So in this vlog, I'm going to talk about the role of rapport, I guess particularly as it applies to Qigong practice, but also to life in general, and why actually sometimes it's important to not have rapport. So it's valuable, it's useful, but sometimes it's important to actually not have rapport as well. That's going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. All right, so understanding the principle of rapport can be a really valuable thing in some aspects of our Qigong practice and in our lives in general. So essentially, rapport is when we make ourselves similar to, and as part of this, that then helps to form a connection with others. When we have good rapport, we feel like we're on the same side. And when we're on the same side, it often then feels like our communication can be very free. And then as part of that, it also makes it easy for us to do things together. And this can play quite a valuable role. A valuable role in all of life because often it's easier to achieve the things that we want to by getting alongside people and then working together collectively, having that close connection as part of that. This also applies in some aspects of our Qigong practice, particularly in terms of learning and teaching, and also some therapeutic effects as well, where often by getting into rapport, a teacher is able to guide their students in quite subtle ways by making that connection, so becoming similar with one another in some ways. And this there can be lots of things. It can be posture, it can be the language that we use, it can be the direction we face in, it can be all sorts of different things that help us to recognize the similarity between us. What happens is we then form an unconscious connection. I mean, it can be conscious, but often this tends to work at an unconscious level. And then we will tend to copy each other in other more subtle things as well. So we use some big obvious things to form rapport, and then the more subtle things tend to follow along. And that then can do all sorts of interesting things, like affect the circulation of our blood and our hormones and our nerve activity. And, to sort of sum all this up, the way our energy flows and functions. So by having rapport, a teacher is able to help actually a student to guide their energy and maybe open up energy flows and experience things that previously maybe they hadn't. And as they become familiar with that, ideally hopefully develop their own skill with that, having been led into that. From the student side, well, again, it can be valuable for a student to understand the role of rapport and relax into being in rapport. Because depending on our background and things we've experienced, some of us can be very hesitant about forming a connection with other people and following along with them. We can be, quite guarded, and sometimes we've got very good reasons for that we're wanting to protect ourselves. Maybe we've had bad experiences in the past, and so we tend to keep ourselves separate and not want to. And again, most of the time this operates at an unconscious level. Sometimes it can be conscious, but not want to follow along with and get into rapport in case that leads us to somewhere bad, in case that causes us some harm. So from the student side to, well, I guess there's a bit of a judgment call required there initially from a student in terms of like, is this a teacher that I feel like it's safe and good for me to get into rapport with? You might observe a little bit first before choosing to get into rapport. You might go, do I like what's going on here? Do I like the direction this is heading in subtle ways? What's going with the energy? And if you do, then you're like, okay, cool. It's okay for me to relax into it. Because to some extent, as you get into rapport, you're often then allowing the other person to steer and guide things a little bit. You're giving over some of it's not that you're like completely giving up your control, but you are handing the steering wheel over to some extent to someone else. Yeah, in terms of following along with them. You can take it back when you want, but you're handing that over. And so you're a bit of trust there. You can do that. And then that can be really good. In the right situation, because that can actually, it can guide you in subtle ways to experience different things. Again, this often applies in a therapeutic interaction as well, in terms of working with some of the subtlety of what might be going on within someone's body, within their mind as well, and certainly within their energy. That the use of rapport can be used, again, to make a connection, and then for the person who's conducting the therapy, the person who's in the driving seat, essentially, hopefully, to then help to guide that person's energy, guide what's going on in their body and in their mind and their energy into a healthier state. Yeah, and this is by making the connection, by being in rapport. So it's a valuable thing. It's valuable to understand how to get into rapport, how it works, the benefits that can come from it. But as with all these things, there's always a flip side. And there can be times where it's really important to not be in rapport. And sometimes for people who have, sometimes it's just an unconscious thing. They always want to connect. They always want to be alongside with other people. And they just have a natural habit of just always getting into rapport. Some it's unconscious. For some it's conscious. They've actually consciously decided, hey, rapport is a good thing. I want to get into rapport with everyone, whenever they can. Sometimes they can get into rapport or want to stay in rapport in situations where it's not so useful to them. And again, the extreme, I mean, it's not necessarily too extreme, is in a situation where maybe by being in rapport, because that link flows both ways. That communication that goes on at a subtle unconscious level flows both ways when we're in rapport. And so, yes, one person might be guiding, but the other person is also helping to guide to some extent as well as you go together somewhere. And if someone is guiding that in a harmful direction, okay, you might want to break that link, get out of rapport so that you don't follow them, right? And this is an interesting thing. The more you work with these principles with rapport, and again, a lot of this functions unconsciously, but we can become consciously aware of it, particularly as we tune into more subtle things with our energy, and we start to notice details and so on. The shift between, we can notice more clearly the shift between one person staring and the other person staring a little bit more. And this can happen in all sorts of connections with people. A good clear one being in a therapeutic interaction where ideally the therapist should be the one steering things. But sometimes if they get too deeply into rapport, they can end up following along with whatever's going on with the client, the person who's being worked on, the person receiving the therapy. And this can then lead to the therapist then taking on some of the harmful energy patterns and so on, or maybe psychological patterns, whatever it is, from the person they're working on. That's not healthy. And so you want to find a way to be able to balance and moderate the rapport. So it's often a case of keeping ourselves safe, right? That we need to know when to break the rapport and be out of rapport to create separation. It's not just that though. There are also times when in an interaction, not just for our own safety, but for the other person as well, sometimes we achieve a better result, a different result, by being out of rapport rather than being in rapport. So that in rapport is really useful, again, for connecting, for leading, for guiding, for like going along with something together. In some situations, what the other person really needs is actually to identify that we are separate. They need to break out of rapport. Maybe that's something they need to learn to do for themselves to understand when it's good to break rapport. But they need to identify the separateness. And sometimes what they really need is to be able to take things on for themselves and recognize this is my thing that I need to address for myself. And so instead of helping them by being in rapport and leading them and guiding them, it's to be out of rapport and to give them separate feedback or separate instruction, right, as to what they need to do. And so there's an element of separateness to that. And that then puts it much more on them to then take hold of that and do what they need to do. And there's certain situations where that's really, really important, because just going along together might actually allow them to continue to be too reliant and not allow them to develop that ability to self-direct, self-guide, and essentially to stand up for themselves, have their own independence. So as with all these things, there's a balance. Something that's really, really useful doesn't mean it's always the thing to do. Sometimes the flip side, the complete opposite of that, is actually the thing that we need that's going to be most effective, most healthy in some situations. Anyway, hopefully that's been useful, informative, interesting. I cover a wide variety of topics in these vlogs. It's something that's been quite interesting about doing this 100 days or 100 vlogs in 100 days that I'm doing. It's like, wow, I'm having to make a lot of vlogs, and it's great that some people have been sending in topics and some people are still sending them in for me to talk about, and that's great. And so I'm addressing some of those. I've still got some that I haven't addressed. I'm going through some of those, and that gets into quite a wide variety of different topics. But then also at the same time, because it's like, man, I've got a lot of vlogs that I need to make. Sometimes other ones that I think of myself, I think, you know what, I think that'd be useful. Maybe not a topic I'd normally talk about, but I'm making so many of these vlogs, I might as well talk about that as well. So, yeah, hopefully it's interesting getting into all these diverse topics. Hopefully, at least some people are getting some useful insight from them. I look forward to seeing you on the next one soon.